So we're going to hear from Dan, who's made apps, who's now helping other people make apps. How are we going to get your applications as compatible as possible on Android? Take it away, Dan.
Thank you very much. So it's great to be here, and I see that people are going to enjoy this presentation because they're eating lunch. And so I really thank the organizers for that. That's awesome. Just to get an idea of who I'm talking to, how many people out here are developers or engineers? Nice. Wow, not good question. Now, and how many people out here are producers? Okay, so this is a great crowd. It's fabulous to be here. I wanted to show the first thing I wanted to show was just something to talk about where we are today. Now, if I came here last year and talked, we did not have a web market. We did not have in-app payments. And actually, our story was not as compelling. We did not have the kind of device numbers we're going to see today. And I'll go through that a little bit. But what's kind of cool to see is that 9 of the 10 top grossing applications, and this is not just games, this is applications across all of Android market, are free-to-play games monetizing through in-app purchases. And so what does this mean to you? Well, as we talked about earlier, we have seen over 100 million activations as of May when we did Google I/O. That was the last time we released that number. And of course, as of July, we're now at 550,000 activations a day. And what does that mean? That means people who've taken their phone, turned it on for the first time, and we at Google have seen it check in for the very, very first time. So these are real users with real devices. These are not sales into sales channels. So the question is, obviously we have a huge opportunity for game developers. But what do we do to get our game onto this diverse set of devices? Well, you know, it started out being pretty easy. We had one device. Aggressive compatibility meant that it ran really well on this one device. Then we added another one which took away the keyboard and added a little bit more memory. And of course, then we saw a lot of proliferation going on in the market. So the question is, with all of these diverse devices, how do we address as many of them as possible so that you can see your game running happily and getting to as many users as possible? And so that's what we're going to be talking about. It's really about 2 things. It's about making sure that, 1, your title works as well on as many devices as possible, and 2, that it gets to the right consumers. So the first thing I mention is this. Don't panic. It's not the 1990s. These devices all have modern GPUs. They all have bilinear filtering. They can scale really well, and they're all running the same software stack. We don't need to have 1,400 builds to target every single device variant that's out there, because the platform gives you the tools to make this happen. If only there was a guide. As it turns out, there is. Now, how many of you out there knew that Android had a compatibility program? Like, show of hands. Okay, no, we really do. Okay, and not only that, but the actual document, the compatibility definition document, or CDD, is available online. So that you can actually look and see, what should I expect the next handset or tablet to have? So I think the main problem with this is that we didn't put a don't panic button on the cover. Because that clearly is what would have added value to this. Another thing to note is that this is part of our greater compatibility program, which involves the compatibility test suite. And the compatibility test suite is an open source set of tests that all manufacturers who want to make compatible Android devices have to pass. And what does that mean? Well, if you don't have compatibility, you don't get Android Market. It's just that simple. And that's a good thing for everyone, because it means that if you distribute through Android Market, you know that those devices are the ones that have passed our tests. So it's a contract between us and the device manufacturers, and it's also a contract between us and you, so that to make sure that you can maximize what you do. And you know, when we're talking about 550,000 devices per day, we're not talking about random devices. We're talking about compatible devices that have Android Market and that have passed our 20,000 tests. So the next question is, what kind of stuff does this guide have in it? Well, first of all, it has some stuff about display and graphics. And what are interesting things to note there? Well, one is that we say screens have to be a certain size, that they have to have at least a minimum density. And we constrain the aspect ratio. The recognition is we don't want you guys to have to go and develop for every possible aspect ratio out there. So we constrain the form factor. And what does this mean? Well, it means that if these are the screens that are in the vast majority of Android handsets today, that looks like a large surface area. But if you think of it in terms of aspect ratios, it's actually much smaller. And this brings forth the first rule in trying to create a compatible Android game, which is, and this is the tablet that falls from the sky with the rules. One is, consider multiple aspect ratios. It's really important. No one likes to see a game with a big black bar on one side of it or on the other side of it. Find some way to use that space. Wasted space is space that you're not using to market to your consumer. So how do we do this? Well, let's bring Replica Island in. Now, Replica Island was written by one of my former colleagues at Google, and it's a tile-based 2D game. And it's actually a little bit tricky if one wants to scale this, because the temptation is, well, let's just take everything and stretch it out. And that really doesn't look very good. So what he did was he made sure when he designed the game that he designed for a fixed height, but not for a fixed width. And so as we change screen sizes, we just add a few more tiles. And he designed the puzzles so that adding a few more tiles didn't ruin the game. So it did take a little bit of thought from the beginning. And here it is, probably in the most extreme. This is on the absolute smallest screen that it would run on, which is a 1.33 screen at 320 by 240, and an 854 by 480, which actually has the same resolution as same aspect ratio as high-definition television. And as you can see, we just add a few more tiles, a smart camera. The game is incredibly playable on both. But of course, this is for a 2D game, and that's a little bit more of an extreme case. The truth is that 90% of devices out there support OpenGL 2, and every Android device has to support at least some form of OpenGL. So for games that are actually built in 3D, it's simply a question of making sure that the viewport can scale appropriately and it doesn't ruin or affect gameplay. So what else do we know about this document? What else does it tell us? Well, it talks about input. Now, Android must have a soft keyboard. So what does this mean? It means you don't need to implement your own. And a lot of titles immediately go out and say, all right, well, I'm porting from some other platform, and it was really cool because, but people on Android look at the keyboard as one way they customize their experience. So people install all sorts of cool, how many of you out there have an Android phone that does not use the default keyboard? Is anyone out here? It's cool, right? It's awesome, you get used to it. Why, if you're a game developer, would you implement your own keyboard and throw them out of what they're used to? Also, it might have a non-touch navigation option. And of course, it has navigation buttons that Android users are really used to using. So what does this mean? Well, one is that we should make proper use of these keys. The back and menu and home keys do something. And the expectation is that when you press the back key, something happens. Now, hopefully, it doesn't drive gamers crazy. It doesn't quit the game immediately. Because that's a way to get a lot of one-star reviews on Android Market. And hopefully, the home key doesn't actually end progress in the game so that you can't get back. Because the home key is intended to be used for multitasking. It's not intended to be kick me out of my game forever and make me really unhappy and write one-star reviews on Android Market. And finally, the volume keys are important. So, basically, it's very easy for you as an Android developer to eat the volume keys and make them do the wrong thing. So there's kind of two things. One, make sure they get forwarded back to the framework. And other, also make sure that you're actually setting the right volume control stream so that even before your game starts playing any audio, the user can already start adjusting the correct volume. Because by default, those volume keys will adjust the ringer volume. And there's nothing worse than knowing that the game is about to blare a big piece of audio at you and not being able to adjust that. And of course, people have devices that have keys. And it's really, really cool if people can use these keys. Some of them even have game controls on them. And so all you have to do is make sure your game has the ability to adjust to these devices. And it's going to make those users just that much more happy. And I'll go back to Replica Island once more just to show how they solved this problem. Now, Replica Island shipped months and months and months before most of these devices came out. And in fact, it shipped over a year before the Xperia Play shipped with those D-pad controls. But because it was ready with a little configure keyboard dialog, everyone who got those devices actually was able to immediately configure their device to use the keys they wanted, including all that D-pad that's built into the Xperia Play. So again, none of this stuff is hard yet. So Android reports sensors to the application. And that's really cool, because you can see which sensors are available, and you can adjust accordingly. And again, it must accurately report. See, these must things are cool. And it should include a 3-axis accelerometer. Now, a 3-axis accelerometer is in every Android device, I think, out, with the exception of Google TV. Because it really is hard to imagine someone doing that with, Google TV. Even if they do have legs and walk around the house. So, and the other thing, of course, is that it has to comply to the Android sensor coordinate system. And this is a big actual place of incompatibility. And the reason why is that some devices are default landscape devices, and some devices are default portrait devices. And the accelerometer is actually tuned to the default orientation of the device. So, and unfortunately, almost every phone out there is portrait. There are only a few landscape devices out there. So people miss this. But the good news is, with a very, very simple piece of translation, which actually NVIDIA very nicely provided, and they have a marvelous PDF on this online, you can just paste this code in, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. It does the right thing. It makes sure that your accelerometer values look the same, whether you're on portrait or landscape default devices, when you set your orientation in fixed mode. So let's talk just a little bit about touchscreens. So first of all, it's going to be there. It may or may not be a multi-touch touchscreen. Now, the good news is that in almost every current device, it will be. And in most devices, it's actually going to be a true multi-touch display. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Well, let's pull up the Nexus one, because it's actually my great counterexample. So we've got 2 pointers, and it does support multi-touch. But if those pointers were to cross, those points can swap. So it means that a title that has 2 virtual D-pads on the bottom is actually not going to work very well on this device, because there's a chance every single time that that you swap those 2 positions that the controller will get confused and swap the coordinates. So how does one solve this? How does one be compatible? Well, here's the game that did it. They put the default best controls at the bottom of the screen, and they actually check. There's actually an entry we added that allows you to check to see whether you have full multi-touch or whether you have partial multi-touch. With independent tracking. So in this case, this is the standard method. And if it detects the other one, it defaults to diagonal controls, which guarantees those axes don't cross. So that's one way of handling it. There are other things people can do as well. Certainly taking advantage of things like hard keys and trackballs and stuff like that to give people the ability to work around this is useful. The good news is that these devices are mostly going away. People have decided if they want multi-touch, they want real multi-touch. But there's still some out there, so it's worth considering. So the secondary rule, on our slate that fell from the sky, is support flexible input. So let's talk a little bit about performance. Here is what the entire document for the CDD says about performance, which basically is not a lot. It says that we have to be able to launch the browser at a certain speed. It says that messages have to be responded to within a certain period of time, but it contains nothing specific about GPU and CPU performance. So what does this mean to a game developer? Well, of course, there's not a lot to rely on here. Okay? The good news is that performance actually has some vectors that we can use in order to try to key off of as we write our game. One is that devices that are ARM7 are available, and you can actually key off of that as a filter, and we can also filter on OpenGL. But more importantly, what we really want to do is talk about compatibility here. Most Android titles are fill rate bound. So to get best performance, your natural thought might be to turn to texture compression. However, we can see right there in the CDD that they're actually not required to implement it. But they should accurately report what they do. So on Android, there are 4 main varieties of texture compression available. And the good news is that virtually every OpenGL 2 device supports ETC1. Now, while ETC1 isn't great for all circumstances, in the cases where it's good, which is mostly photographic textures, it does a very, very good job. And so you can make sure those textures are compressed equivalently for every device. And the most compatible thing to do, relying on ETC1, and then leave textures that require alpha or textures that require huge amounts of transitions uncompressed. However, for those who really, really want to tune for the best performance, you can also take advantage of ATI-TC, PVR-TC, and DX-TC. And you can query to see which extension your device supports, and you can supply a texture appropriately. That certainly is the highest performance way to go. You'll make the best use of bandwidth, fill rate, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll talk a little bit about how you package a game that does that a little later. So another thing we can do is check for older hardware. And we can do a little bit of profiling, and we can fall back. So one of the things is almost every single piece of older hardware out there does much, much better with 16-bit textures, partially because of fill, and sometimes because of even hardware support. So if you want to ship higher quality 32-bit textures that look awesome on newer devices, you can actually rely on the framework to convert them back down to 16-bit and properly dither them for you. So you don't have to double your asset size or 1.5 your asset size. You can also use a smaller render target and scale up for fill rate. And this is super, super useful. And the reason why is because the framework actually has a compositing step that the system does in something called Surface Flinger. Thank you. Devices are generally fill rate limited, especially tablets. So our next rule is adapt to device performance. And let's give an example of how that happened. Well, how a developer might do that. So this is Dungeon Defenders, and this is a very, very high-performance game. This was originally designed really around Xbox Live Arcade. And what they wanted to do was get it to run on as many devices as possible. So they do two things here. One is that they have a video upscale percentage, which they can allow the user to change. And they actually track that automatically. So they do a little bit of profiling, automatically upscale it as needed. The second thing that they do is they also have a tablet user interface, which they automatically enable for larger devices. It puts the controls out on the sides, gives them a little bit more flexibility. And what does this really look like? Well, here is at full resolution what it looks like on a phone. And this is actually here the upscaled resolution. And for a lot of users, they'll barely even notice that it's happening. Now, this is actually a very, very severe amount of upscaling on this slide. So after all is said and done, there are just going to be some devices that can't play some games. You know, today's handsets are vastly more powerful than the ones of even a year ago, let alone 2 or 3. So how do you make sure that your ratings stay strong and your customers stay happy? And of course, the way we do that is by leveraging Android Market. We'll talk a little bit about what Android Market gives you. Now, Android Market is an open market. You can publish as many times, as often as you want. You set the price. Users have access to your applications right away. And people have done awesome stuff. You can actually, if you heard the previous talk, literally this allows you to iterate super, super fast as you're trying to take advantage of things like social. Understand the impact of your title. It's your consumers, and everyone plays ultimately by the same rules. And so what Android Market allows you to do is filter on a whole bunch of criteria: screen size and density, multi-touch, platform version, OpenGL. We also allow you to deal with devices directly. So you can actually exclude a specific device you find out it's having trouble. All of these things designed to make sure your customers end up happy when they get your game. We have flexible binary support. Very, very soon, we're actually going to be supporting something called multi-APK. And this will actually allow you to package your application multiple times based upon different vectors, whether that's platform version, whether that is texture compression format, or whether that is, in this case, there's 3 things, I'm sure. Oh, and screen size and density. Obviously, that's a very important one. So you can make your application as small as possible to reduce friction, get more people to download it. We're also coming up with large application support. This is going to allow games up to 4 gigabytes on Android Market. And this is coming also very, very soon. We've added a lot of reporting. This is all really important because we want to see how you're actually impacting your customers. So we give you tons and tons of data. I'm going through this super fast because we started 10 minutes late. We also have a lot of flexible monetization things. And this is really important because not only are we doing in-app payments right now, but we're actually supporting direct carrier billing. And just to show you what that means, in a single carrier in Asia, you can actually see we turned on direct carrier billing, which means they get billed through their phone account. And it not only doubled sales, but it actually increased the credit card sales as well. So we're working to do that around the world. And when we think of the life of what a great app looks like on Android Market, the app comes in, and you get into the just-in category. And the developer starts marketing, and that gets the app trending. And it gets it into the top new and free and paid category. And all these categories are now live on not only the website, but on the new Market client. How many people here have seen the new Market client, the new Android Market client on phones? It's pretty cool. If you want, I'll show it to you later. It's coming to all your phones slowly. We're rolling it out. So what does that get you into? Top free and top paid. We feature it. Featuring is the #1 way of making sure your application can get to those 550,000 eyeballs that are joining Android every day, and those 100 million devices that are running Android Market. Finally, you get related views, personal recommendations, top grossing. Again, I showed you that list of the top 10 grossing applications. And then, of course, we now have additional ways of dealing with our curated content with editor's choice. And if you do this a whole bunch of times, you become a top developer. So some final thoughts as we're really, really low on time here. Drive traffic to your application. Think of things like cross-promotion, advertising, and viral marketing. Consider what it means to be free versus paid. Okay? Improve your ranking. Okay? Build great games. Ultimately, that's what we want to see. We want to see the best games and applications on Android Market. So don't launch prematurely. Do a soft launch. You get to experiment. You can launch as many times as you want. You know, Rovio went off and launched Angry Birds Beta. That was super, super useful for them. They got to get all sorts of feedback before they started driving lots of people to their page and potentially driving down their ranking. So, you know, all of these things are super useful. And most importantly, be responsive to your end users. We allow you to have that relationship with your end users. So take advantage of that. And your users will love you. And so that's pretty much it. This was the 20-minute version of the presentation for you guys. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. We have time for a couple of questions. Who wants to go first? Here.
When is the megabyte size for Android Market going to increase from 50 megabytes to 4 gigabytes?
So it's not. So the size for the application package itself is not. What we're going to allow you to do is host a secondary package online, and that's going to be supported by the new Market client, which is shipping out today. It should be in the next few weeks. We are going to be trialing it, and I'm hoping that it'll be released for everyone before the end of the summer.
So it's actually going to be a second portion from, if it's beyond 50 megabytes, it's going to go through a secondary download?
It's going to be part of the. It's going to be secondarily downloaded by Market in a consistent manner. So the user's not going to be able to actually run the application until both packages are there. For a game developer, it just means that that they have to divide their application into a resource fork and to things that contain code.
Thank you. Any other questions? Way in the back.
Hi. So I was just wondering if you could give us a bit of information on how the ranking algorithm works for the Android Market.
That's like asking someone at Google to explain how Google search works. And you know, it's one of those things we do hold near and dear to us. I mean, ultimately, it's something that also, even if I told you how it worked, it's constantly changing. You know, you just in the last week, we made changes, and we're constantly tuning that algorithm to try to get people at the best content. But yeah, it is something we don't talk about.
Any other questions? All right, well, let's thank Dan for his time. Thank you.